The following episode contains or may contain spoilers. So if you're spoiler sensitive, maybe beware.
Yeah, you sensitive people.
Get out.
No, get in.
Attention, denizens of the Phantom Zone. We got big news. We got big news, right, guys? We got big news for our Patreon. It's always been up. We've had it for a long time, but now we actually have real things to offer, and I think that's the big difference.
I am super excited because I love stuff and I love talking about stuff.
Yes.
And the untopicked stuff is awesome.
Yes.
Right.
Oh, yeah. So we do have Patreon exclusive episodes.
Yes,
we
we
call
do.
them Untopicked.
The untopicked.
We made up a word for you.
Yeah. We're not bound by the tyranny. We're emancipated from the tyranny of topics.
Yes.
Yeah.
So we talk about kind of what's going on in our personal lives, Untopicked from our normal episodes.
And also Game of Thrones.
Yeah, until Game of Thrones ends. But then I'm sure Kayla will find a way to
Incorporate
shoehorn
it,
that in.
always.
So if you donate to our Patreon, you automatically get access to those episodes. You also get a little bit of merch.
Yes.
Yeah, and you get discounts on other merch, and that's exciting.
Yes.
Yeah.
So merch.
I have
Double
a tote bag
merch.
and a shirt. And I want
Yeah.
those stickers, man.
It's very exciting. You're automatically entered into any of our giveaways, which we do on a regular basis. That's all kinds of crap. All you have to do is donate to our Patreon, and also you will be helping our podcast.
All right, welcome to the Phantom Zone. 3 fans, 1 podcast, and a sea of comics. I felt like in my mind I was saying that wrong, but it came out right. So,
Yay.
I'm Noah.
Kayla.
And I'm ready. My name's Jared.
Oh, I was like, we replaced it. No, we didn't.
With ready.
He's a Dutch exchange podcaster.
So today our topic is a Patreon fan pick episode. So they picked The Exiles, which is an alternate version of X-Men, alternate timeline, all that stuff. And we thought it'd be a good opportunity to take that topic and run with it. So we all picked kind of our favorite X-Men alternate timeline story type things. And we'll be talking about those. So yes, thank you for our Patreon picker. Just so you know, you can also pick an episode by going there and figuring out how to do that. But there's links to it on all our social
Support
media.
our Patreon, control our thoughts. That's how it works.
Exactly. So we'll jump right into it with alternate X-Men timelines.
Yeah. A thing that happens a lot.
A lot. Like within the same storylines.
Let me pose a question real quick. Just before we get into Xiness, which is its own world. It's just alternate timelines generally are very popular in sci-fi, specifically in comics. What do you think it is about? I don't know why I have that tone. What do you think what do you think it's about that as like kind of a literary appeal that's made it so
Professor
popular?
Jared, I think.
Thank you. You will be graded on a curve. Just saying.
Thanks. I feel like it's kind of a fun mind game to think about or see your favorite characters doing something that they might not do necessarily in, like the main continuity or like in general. If something different happens. I know we talked about this in like the death episode.
Yeah.
But I mean, origin stories for characters kind of shape their mentality going forward. If something's changed in their past, they're not the same person. So, I think it's just fun to kind of see characters that you love and kind of see their alternate selves and how crazy they could be.
Yeah, I think that's the main reason for it. It's like a writer's like, hey, I have a cool idea, but this character would never do that. Let me make them do that.
Yeah.
But it has nothing to do with like the main storyline. I think a lot of big events or events in general sometimes do that. So you kind of see them in this weird like alternate timeline type thing because as that event's happening, other comics are still coming out. So like Heroes in Crisis is currently happening, but in the Batman comic, it's not happening in his comic, and I'm sure until that story ends. So they do this weird alternate timeline with stuff like that too. So I don't know.
There's definitely a road less traveled aspect to this kind of thing. You have decisions that any major Marvel or DC moment where, like, what if Supergirl had not died during Infinite Crisis or whatever?
It'd be great.
It'd be super. But yeah, there's I think a real temptation for like fans in terms of curiosity, like what would have happened, and that means that writers know there's an sort of inherent interest in it or whatever.
That's all. It gets kind of confusing too, because unless they strictly say this is a one shot, or most of the time we know it is, but sometimes that stuff bleeds into the main continuity. So it's like, is this canon? Technically, they did do this. Yes. Do I say like this character does have this power that was only in this one issue when it's not in the main continuity? So I think it does get a little confusing.
Well, that's a huge distinction right there, because that's absolutely true. That like there was like what if in Marvel. Which was kind of like these are short, like episodic kind of single stories where what if this happened instead of that happened? But it's not. It's inherent to them that it's just contained within that hypothetical story. But the ones that we're talking about today, maybe they started that way, but that they, because of interest in fans or the stories just could have built on, they've had like attraction and have this weird consistent reality all their own. At least they did for a while.
Yeah, or sometimes whenever the alternate timeline comic comes out, it wasn't necessarily well received at first. And then it gets this following years later and they're like, oh, we could do a sequel now. And it's like, well, can you? Should you? I don't know. Yeah. So, I mean, I don't know. Alternate timelines I like a lot, but I don't like it as an excuse just to do shock value.
Which is definitely a thing that we see a lot.
Yeah, it's like, oh, it was all a dream. It's like, well, then you made me cry for nothing. Like, these characters have no idea this happened, and it's never going to matter.
we actually talked about death in the last episode, or one of the earlier episodes, and that's something that happens a lot, which is they do all these temporary alternate timelines just so like, what if Spider-Man got his head cut off or whatever? Like, why do we want to see that, for one? But
yeah. I mean, I agree. I think there's a place for them. And it does seem like X-Men have a lot of them. I mean, if you just look at the comic book shelves now, I don't know what's currently happening while other ones are happening. Because you have X-Men blue, red, black, yellow. Then you have X-Man. Then you have Uncanny X-Men. Then you have, I don't fucking know, sensational, super awesome X-Men going on.
No, you're absolutely right. It's like you go to the comic store and the comic guy's like, this is all the stuff happening in X-Men. And this is all the stuff that's technically not happening in X-Men.
Alternate dimensions, stuff like that.
Yeah, like you had the whole Jean Grey comic, which I loved that little mini run. I don't know what happened to it. But that was really great. And, you know, you had Jean in the present from the past, young Jean, come back while older Jean is still around, and dealing with the Phoenix. And you had all the people that had come in contact with the Phoenix. It was really good. But then you read the other X-Men ones. I'm like, all those people just died in that one. What? Okay, cool. And also Nightcrawler is a baby and they call him Pickles. So I don't know if that's canon now.
So we should put a flag there, which is just that we have to admit, when you have a bunch of alternate timeline stuff going on, you make it inherently confusing, especially for new readers who are looking for like, what's the linear actual thing that's happening in the comic.
Oh yeah. I mean, when people ask me about X-Men, I'm always like, yeah, I love them. They're really confusing. It's hard to just follow one character and all of the different things that are going on. But in terms of alternate realities, I always kind of feel bad because that path, the conclusion of the story is normally trying to like get rid of the alternate timelines. Like, oh, that's a dark one. We better get rid of that.
That's interesting.
And then so everyone in that timeline that you kind of like got to read and see is gone now. It's just the original cast, and I don't know.
Yeah, it's a way for them. Sad. It's a way for them to kind of like do some housekeeping and like clean up. But then if the story's not received well, they kind of just pretend like it didn't happen.
No, absolutely. Well, and I think there's a lot to say about why the X-Men specifically have this either also problem maybe or awesome thing that happens. It's sort of a little both. One is this little thing happens in sci-fi called time travel. the existence and frequency of time travel happens to be a lot in comics and sci-fi, specifically a lot in X-Men comics. And I don't want to say that door is broken, but it's certainly been wedged open, and hard to close.
It's like everybody has the key to it.
Yeah.
Depending
I'm sure
on
someone axed a hole in the door.
Yeah. They did a Shining, just opening it with the axe. I mean, I don't know. Time travel's cool. We'll get into it a little later, but if it's done right and it has a purpose, but not just because, oh, by the way, this X-Men can now time travel and this is what's happening with that. It's like, well, okay, why? I
think it was Julia Child that said that time travel is a powerful spice. Too much ruins the dish. That's almost certainly her. I'm positive.
You have to do it in her voice, though.
Time travel is a powerful spice. I actually became...
Why did you make him do that?
Yeah. Because it was funny.
Yeah. I'm glad I wore this dress. Anyway.
So, I think one of the... X-Men have so much time alternate lines, so much that it bleeds into the movies, too.
Yeah.
And I haven't understood why they did that. I don't know if they just wanted to be like, well, technically the original trilogy of X-Men still happened, but now we have a better cast and we are able to do better stories. So we'll just kind of mix all of it into this weird jumbled mess.
Oh, I didn't. That's an interesting point unto itself, which is just that they had these two generations of X-Men actors after First Class or whatever. So they could actually kind of coherently do time travel story where it wasn't just inventing new characters. It was okay, let's take these characters from this very successful part of the franchise and this very successful, and we'll just do a story that joins them. And I think the other thing, like you mentioned, is that, and we're going to talk about, some of the most classic X-Men stories have been time travel oriented, and the movies always have that like we should adapt this.
Yeah. Part of me feels so the original X-Men trilogy should have just been laid to rest. Should have been done. They could still use some of the same actors, but just do the stories again. Just do a reboot. Because that's what they did. They got new actors. They got mostly new actors to play some iconic characters. And it's just redo it. Just reboot the story.
They did feel the need to explain the rebooting, though.
Yeah.
Whether they should or not. They were, they felt like they had to go in and...
But I think enough time had passed. Sure. And so many people wanted to forget about X-Men Last Stand that it was this looks good. First Class is good. We welcome this.
Yeah.
Why are you jumbling it with all this other stuff?
To what Jared was saying, they very rarely do you have this thing where characters that played the same character at different ages are all around at the same time still acting. So it's kind of like you had mentioned, a lot of the X-Men stories are time travel stuff. Yeah. So if you have both generations of actors, why not take advantage of it? Because it's something that franchises don't normally have.
Yeah,
that is true.
And yeah, I think almost want to emphasize that they saw this weird, rare opportunity and they seized on it. Now we could kind of argue about how effectively they did or
how successful it was.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think a lot of it too had to do with they weren't constrained by some big studio. So if Disney or Marvel had rights to X-Men to do it, then they would never do this.
It would have been off the table.
Yeah, it would have been off the table, but I think they were like, well, our shit's going to go back to the people that own it, so let's go out with a bang with it, I guess, or do whatever we want.
I'd also like to sort of mention, because I think we're talking about X universes and X alternate timelines and stuff like that, and I think it's worth sort of exploring why is it that the X-Men stuff is so prone to this, besides just the convention of time travel. I think there's something interesting about the X universe if you're a comic reader, in that it's this isolated universe within a larger universe. It's you have Marvel comics, and clearly all the X-Men characters deal with all they're
in the Avengers.
They're in the Avengers. They fight the Hulk, all that kind of stuff. But in its own way, that it's kind of ecology all its own.
Yeah. That's true, because there's a lot of stories with the X-Men, especially alternate timelines, dystopian futures and stuff, that they have to remind the readers, oh, by the way, there's the Hulk and Captain America are still around. They have to show a panel of this is what the other super powered people are doing, and then they go back to X-Men. It's oh yeah, I forgot that
and vice versa. In Civil War, there was a panel where Iron Man with Tony Stark meets with Emma Frost. where they have to
which is a weird meeting.
Well, they have to
unto
explain
itself.
why the X-Men won't be involved, you know.
I mean, I like that, though, only because as readers and as fans, we would probably wonder that if no X-Men showed up in any of the big events. Yeah. It's like, were you guys too busy, like, having a protest outside a White House to like deal with this huge global threat right now?
And I think it's cool that they've done that. Like, there are logistical difficulties because you do have to explain, like, why isn't Jean Grey here? She'd be helpful. She's a hero.
Yeah.
But it's allowed to create this sort of, it's got its own mythos on the basis that it's, you know, in some sense separate. If it was just diffused throughout the Marvel universe and you always had like Vision hanging out with Kitty Pryde and stuff like that, because they both phased. That was an accident. Anyway, then I think, you wouldn't have an X universe, and it's probably for the best.
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot like the Inhumans. Like, they have such a rich history just within their inner team, and their own conflicts and their own like superpowered villains and stuff, that I think it does require a lot of attention within their own universe. And I mean, the X-Men are all about, you know, equal rights and discrimination and stuff like that. So, I mean, putting them in the larger aspect of the world, like adding Captain America in there and Iron Man and Thor and all that, it doesn't seem as meaningful if it's characters that don't have anything to do with that aspect of the story.
Absolutely. Yeah, it would lose some thematic power if you just put any other kind of character. And what's cool about that is that we're going to see that in the stuff we talk about today.
Yes.
Because there's some sense about like Xavier's dream or like the integration of mutants and humans versus the war between them is going to, like, a lot of the alternate timelines in X universe are sort of about how does that go. It's not just like, what if a meteor hit and killed all the dinosaurs? It's usually specific to like, what if Magneto was right or something like that. You know?
Well,
yeah. Don't get me started, guys.
Yeah.
Sometimes he is.
Yeah.
Just not that extreme.
Yeah.
All right, we'll jump into I guess the fan pick part of this episode with the Exiles.
Heck yeah, that's mine. I'm doing it.
Only because I know diddly squat about the Exiles.
And Kayla knows less.
Yeah.
This will be fun. This is the reason for the season, which is not the appropriate use of that expression, but it rhymes.
I love rhymes. Good job.
We all love rhymes. I think this is kind of like the perfect one to start with because Exiles is no stakes. Okay? I mean, it is within its own story, but what I mean is like the other two that we're going to talk about, very, very important to the X-Men mythos and everything like that. Exiles is quality unto itself, but weirdly separated from the rest of the X universe. It's very fun. It's very meta in a way. So to give you an idea, what's that? It's very meta. So are we allowed to fire you? I can't remember how this no, okay, fine.
Do you know how to edit an episode?
I don't even know how to listen to it half the time. Like, how does this machine work? It's like, well, you're on an analog television, so that won't work. Anyway. Okay, so the Exiles. It's very exciting. It's fantastic. It's great. It's the greatest scene. Okay.
Are you going to tell us about it?
Yes. Sorry. Okay. Sometimes I'm like I need a pull cord, like a chainsaw. I just have to get into it. Anyway, so I'll put it this way. Are you guys familiar with the show Quantum Leap? Anybody? Scott Bakula, fantastic.
No.
Show. No, well, here's the thing. Anybody over 35 listening will be like, of course, I have that back tattoo. Okay, so the way Quantum Leap worked, the way this works is a character who sci-fi magically teleported to a different timeline every episode and had to fix a problem. And that's basically what our series is, but with X-Men characters. And the reason that's important, I want to put this out there immediately. A lot of times people say, when there's like kind of a derivative idea, they'll say, oh, it's just X, but with Y. You know, so there was an Avengers Arena thing, which was just like Marvel kids, like youth characters, but it was like Hunger Games. People go, oh, this is just like the Hunger Games, blah, blah. Yeah, well, it's good. And that's what kills me. It's like, you can't just succinctly describe something and put just in front of it and call that a criticism.
Yeah.
Well, this is just this and that.
Well, there's nothing new under the sun. Everything is just your spin.
Exactly. So that's the way this series functions is, I'll begin with the first scene and it'll explain exactly what the series is, and that's why it's so good. Oh, I should say real quick, it was written by Judd Winnick. It came out in 2001, and the primary artists were Mike McKone and Jim Calafiore. I don't know how to say his name, but
that's a good attempt.
Yeah, thank you. And a curtsy. But it's they really, really good work. The art's fantastic. On that basis alone, it's worth picking up. But anyway, so the first scene in this, 7 mutants, 6 or 7, Count it out. You'll
forgettable one.
Yeah. Well, it's an ensemble cast, but they end up in a beach in the middle of nowhere. Suddenly, they don't know why they're there, and then suddenly a character who will reveal himself as the Time Broker, who looks a lot like Jarvis. By the way,
cool name.
Yeah, tells them that they've all been detached from time. Their timelines have become perverted and ruined, and that each one of them is like gonna it's like one of their realities is destroyed. The other one they turn evil and are possessed by Mephisto.
They're just
kind of
orphans.
Yikes.
Exactly.
Of time.
And it's because the time stream itself, which they describe something like a DNA strand where if like one piece is messed up, the whole thing gets messed up, has become messed up, and they've got to go fix it, or they'll all die. Essentially.
Okay.
So
wait, just them or their timelines?
Well, the timelines are some are just perverted and awful. They don't have a life to go back to. Is the point? Because either they're comatose or dead, or like I said, possessed by Mephisto, which is a thing I made up. But
so basically, they can't opt out. Like they have to do this.
They can't opt out, and and their mission is as a team to go from alternate timeline to alternate timeline to fix the mistake that's taken place that's similar to the mistake that messed up them. The logic being, if you correct, it's sort of like a body. If you get rid of the bad cells, it'll sort of right itself or something like
heal
that.
itself.
Yeah, so that becomes their job. And you can kind of see how this would be a great vehicle for kind of like episodic adventures. You know what I mean? So you don't have to tell that now, much like the X-Files, not to be mistaken with the X-Files, there is an overarching story here. They have their own continuity. They have their timelines. You learn more about their character. But for the most part, the thing functions by each episode or each issue or each story arc is a particular one. The first one, I don't want to spoil it, but they go to this world where all the mutants and all the superpower beings are being held captive. Like, in other words, the human population never was okay with it. Immediately cracked down. And they're given very vague instructions that say, get your mentor. And save the one that would teach you, something to that effect. Something very vague.
Just put out a tweet.
Turns out it's very fortune cookie kind of things they have to do. So they have this vague sense about what they have to do. Again, much like Quantum Leap. So they have to kind of figure it out and deal with the circumstances. And turns out that in this universe, it's not. They're all like, oh, it must be Professor X. Turns out he's bad, and they were wrong.
So the first person they go to is like, oh, let's go to the guy that would help us.
It's great. It's a great scene because they're all X characters, right? And most of them come from timelines that are much like our own with slight differences. So when they're like, you got to find your teacher, they're all like, oh, it's Professor X. Yeah. They say it in unison. And they turn out to be all very wrong. And the sense of humor is very much like that, which is like consistent senses of like irony and silliness and stuff like that. I want to talk, mention the way this kind of functions. They have their own, like, what's the Doctor Who
TARDIS.
phone? But yeah, so they don't have a TARDIS. They have
know about Quantum Leap, but not Doctor Who.
Yes. They don't have a TARDIS. They have a TALIS,
then.
Yeah, it's a little different. I'll go into the characters in a second, but it's a big bracelet that one of them wears and kind of tells them. So that's kind of their link and their mechanism by which they hop from reality to reality. So a few breakout stars. Blink. So Blink is from the Age of Apocalypse, a thing we'll talk about soon. And she was a breakout star. She was a character that was really, really sort of popular. She was on all 90s posters and stuff like that. And she's appropriate for this because her power is to like teleport, to throw these like shards, that energy shards that then like teleport or whatever. So it's very comparable with the whole.
Did she just teleport too far? She ended up on that beach.
Well, no. Apparently, she never. Her thing was that she never was born. That's why she ends up being detached for time, and so that's why they pick her or whatever. Anyway,
comics are weird.
Yeah. So she's a breakout star. And what's interesting too is that like Blink, even though she's this character that existed beforehand, she's flushed out more in this series, which lasts for over 100 issues. By the way, it was a very successful series, very underground hit. Yeah, it was very popular, especially without having a major character or like a movie or a TV show or anything like that. And another character that's really important to the show is Mimic. And Mimic is a character that's Calvin Rankin is his name. He was a minor character in our universe. He's actually one of the first characters that like the X-Men fight. He's a character that can copy the powers of other mutants, but he only can do 5 at a time, and they're about half strength. So if you remember
Interesting.
in the
Jack
first,
of all trades.
Absolutely. And you remember
Halfway.
X-Men, the first team was 5 characters. So I was like, oh, so there's 5 team members, and it just happened that you can have 5 powers.
I also like how his
Fantastic.
power just has that limit. Like
Yes.
just 5.
Well, it is kind of important for this because it's an ensemble cast, so they can't have this character that's like Peter from Heroes where he can just do anything or whatever.
Yeah.
So he has this cool sort of versatile power, but it definitely has limitations. And it's also appropriate because they're doing this X-Men jet-setting, world-hopping kind of adventure thing. So you have a character that's very like mobile and can reflect other X characters are super cool. And then the comic relief, which is Morph. Which is a shape changer like Mystique, but he's basically a goofy Deadpool type. So it has that sort of silly, ridiculous character.
I would imagine reading him in the comics and hearing his voice from the TV show.
Yes.
Do you remember his voice from the TV show?
Yeah,
It was really
He
obnoxious.
was very high-pitched, nasal, a bit sinister.
Yeah.
Because on the show, he actually becomes kind of a bad guy.
Yeah.
So our Morph in this series looks very different. He has a completely like white face with almost just 2 eyes. And his face is always like sort of like with no features at all except for those 2 eyes and a mouth. It's kind of creepy. He's very like slapstick. Anyway. So there are other characters, of course, but the problem is that they have a tendency to die. And in I don't want to tell anybody if in case they do pick up the series, which I heavily recommend. After the first story arc, one character dies, and as soon as they're dead, they're immediately replaced by another character. Yes, and so it's such a cool thing for the reader because it's got a Walking Dead thing with slightly less realistic vibe, but definitely dramatic and high stakes. And not only are you like, oh, any character that I love could die, but I almost want them to get a new character.
That's so sad.
Because every new character has like a character we know, but they're a slightly different version. So this is an example, but it would be like, oh, it's Storm, but from that story, that alternate universe where she was like married to Dracula. So it's like a Storm, but also a vampire. Her name was Bloodstorm. It was a great story.
She's
unto
amazing.
Itself. Yeah. But it's just as a story, it's an awesome like ensemble cast. And there's just enough change to like keep it interesting. And let's see. Oh, and I think what's really cool about this series is maybe this will stand for all the X Universe stuff, is that it's all about the similarities and the differences. Because at some level, these are characters, like there's so many parts of the story where they have to go to another X universe. And they're like, oh, I have to deal with, it's just like my Charles, right? And he's our mentor, and they but I have to kill him, and it's awful. It's like that scene in zombie movies where it's like the daughter becomes a zombie, and the dad's like, you're my little girl, I can't kill you. But she's like chewing on an eyeball, and like half of her face is gone. It's like, that's not your daughter anymore, man. Okay. So there's a lot of that. And then there's also the huge differences where they obviously go to a universe where like all the water is acid and only mutants can survive or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, it does have a lot of similarities to Doctor Who. Like even just outside of that, only because he does go to different timelines and there's different realities and stuff.
Well, I think it works a lot with this concept. I think works well with X-Men characters in general because a lot of the characters are so gray that it's like it's not inconceivable that they would go or act that way in different universes.
Absolutely. And in this series, mentioned Gray, they have to make very hard choices. Sometimes their mission will be like, you've got to kill this boy. That'll later on like kill all the girls. I don't know. Like just like he's going to grow up to be like
the
a
Hitler
despot
thing.
Exactly. And they get to make just those things. Another thing that's cool about this series, which I really did like, is that in a time now in the crossover world where every major overarching story is sort of like precedented by an earlier one that then has to have consequences for later. So like with Marvel, since Civil War, every story has been like, this sort of necessary consequence of an early story. And you feel almost like kind of caught in that, where it's like with this kind of happened unto itself, start to finish. It feels like a big parenthesis. So there's something really nice about that it's self-contained. And it was very popular, and you should read it because it's good. And then the last thing I'll mention, it's worth, is that a series Exiles came out in 2018. It was a 12-issue series, and it didn't do as well. I think it was a little bit less inspired. It didn't stick to just X universe characters. And that was a big thing about this, to limit the kind of, they could go anywhere and do anything and have any characters. It mostly stuck within the X universe. Though what's weird about that, it was never really explicitly stated. So in the beginning, the Time Broker's not like, the X universe is in danger. It just kind of stuck loosely.
Maybe just because they were X-Men characters.
Exactly. Yeah.
They're most likely to go to X universe.
Well, the emotional baggage wouldn't be there if it was like...
Yeah, go kill Tony Stark. They're like, who?
Yeah, like, wait a minute, that rich dude? Yeah. Let's kill him and Elon Musk. Can we do it with twofer? Will that save the world? And then, but it's also, it got canceled in 12 issues. But one cool thing was it happened to include Valkyrie from the Thor Ragnarok movie.
Huh.
And so they brought her.
That's super awesome.
Exactly. This was sort of the Harley Quinn moment where this was the series that brought her into Marvel canon. So that's so she's with us now. That's kind of cool.
Huzzah!
Yeah, Tessa Thompson.
So it got canceled? It wasn't a mini?
It was an ongoing series, but it made it to 12 issues and the sales weren't there. I think the problem is one, the Exiles came out in 2001, so there's a bunch of new readers that just had no, even though it was a relatively popular series at the time, they had no context and weren't particularly excited about it. And like I said, I think that this caught lightning in a bottle a little bit. It was never this huge franchise. It was just a really, really solid story for a lot of circumstances. The creative team was amazing. So it's just kind of hard to kind of try to make that this ongoing sort of franchise or whatever.
Well, and like we said earlier, I mean, adding another X-Men title on the shelves is okay. It has to be really good and knock it out of the park, or it's just going to get lost in the sea of X-Men.
No, that's absolutely true. But I will say, sort of in summation, at least to the Exiles thing, definitely worth picking up because of the kind of all over the place. You never know what's going to happen. Kind of jet setting story, but it was always really, really high quality. And they go to some outlandish places. So I'm glad we got to do this. I'm glad we got to mention it. If the Patreon pick we probably never would have gotten to.
Probably.
Maybe years later.
Yeah. Maybe years later, exactly. But it's good that we did because I think a strong recommendation on my part. Good stuff. Okay, so that's Exiles. That's the reason, in some sense, that inspired the episode. But seeing as how we're doing X universes, X alternate timelines, there is an original one. There is one that really started this entire trend based on the strength of the story, and I think Noah's going to kind of cover that one.
Yeah, Days of Future Past, which is one of my favorite X-Men storylines, and it's only 2 issues. It happened, which...
That blew my mind.
Yeah.
When you told me. I'd read it before a long time ago, but I did not know that.
Yeah, the story itself, the original story from start to finish is in Uncanny X-Men's issues 141 and 142. And it was done after that. That was it. It's written by Chris Claremont and John Burns.
Big shock there.
Yeah. Well, the funny thing is, as I was doing research for this, Chris Claremont didn't want to do an alternate storyline or anything, but John Burns presented it, and he's like, well, fine, okay.
Sure.
Let's do it since you did most of the work.
Yeah.
Then I'll do it.
Yeah.
But so the story, as if you've seen the movie, completely different in the comics, except for have to stop Mystique from killing a political figure.
Yeah.
That's it. So in the comic, it's Kitty Pryde, she's the main protagonist of this story.
Which is why you love the story so much.
Which, yes, because so Kitty Pryde was introduced, I believe it was 10 issues previous to this one, and she had disappeared because there was a big event going on and she just wasn't in the comics, and then they came out with this, and she finally got her moment to shine, and it really showed what this character can do, even though it's a future version of her. So in the comics, it takes place in current times in the 1980s and in the future of 2013. Yeah, but in the movie, it takes place in, I guess, current time, but in the time of 1973 and 2023. So the time jump is
a lot different.
A lot bigger. And so I thought that was interesting because they had to send Wolverine back in the movie because that big of a difference. The people in First Class, there's just, the people aren't alive and they're just not old enough. So it's who's been alive longest? Oh, Wolverine.
Yeah, so there was a good reason that wasn't just Hugh Jackman's hugely popular.
Yeah, and Wolverine is hugely popular.
Absolutely.
Exactly. And so the story takes place in the comic in New York. New York is the only place ran by these Sentinels, and these Sentinels were made to capture, not kill like in the movie. They were mainly capturing mutants. So that's a huge stark difference for me. I'm going to be talking a lot about the differences because I think more people know about the movie than the comic. So in the comic, they were mainly focused on capturing them and apprehending them, and they would kill if they need to, which they kill a fuck ton of characters. In the movie, they were just straight up murdering anybody that got in their way. Like, I think the one that like broke my heart the most was Iceman. He just snapped his head off and then stomped on his head. And I think they did the same thing to Colossus. They just punched his head. Whatever. I mean, it's ridiculous.
Pretty brutal.
Yeah, so in the comic, a lot of characters are already dead. The entire Fantastic Four, with the exception of Franklin Richards, future Franklin Richards, is dead.
Of course, Franklin survived.
Yeah.
But he was way less powerful back then.
Yeah, he was way less powerful, but it's also funny that it's like Sue, Reed, Ben, Johnny, they're all dead.
Can I just say that panel, by the way, in some ways is more haunting than anything else.
With all the tombstones and all that. Yeah, I mean, everybody from Nightcrawler, I think Professor X is dead. Everybody's just dead. So you start the story off with she's in one of the camps that they set up, and she's a medic. She's running back and forth to get supplies. And of course, everybody's hatching a plan to stop these neck braces that dampen their powers. And there's a character in the comic, Rachel Summers, which is a future offspring of Jean and Scott. In the movie, Kitty Pryde is the one that sends Wolverine back. Where
she got magical powers.
So somebody said she learned how to phase people's consciousness. I'm like, you can't
back into their younger body.
Yeah, don't use the word phase like that.
I mean, it's a creative attempt. I think clearly they were trying to have like sort of an homage to the comics, but it's not necessary.
Yeah, I mean, if you're doing a future version, you already put Blink in there. You put all these. There's Bishop? A couple. Yeah, Bishop was in there. Forge, I believe, was in there too. I mean, I don't know. Yeah. There's a bunch of random characters that have never appeared again. Warpath. There we go. That's his name. So to not put Rachel Summers in there was just confusing to me because it's like, why not? I mean, you already have all these characters that died and nobody knows anyway. So anyway, this. So Rachel sends Kitty's consciousness back into the past, into her younger self. And she has to try to convince the X-Men of like, we need to stop this assassination attempt that will pretty much be the catalyst to this fatal event that's going to kill all of us. So you can see where the initial struggle would be to convince the other X-Men. And I believe, telepathy comes into play and they're like, yeah, I believe her. She's right. Because I can tell that she's not lying.
That helps a lot.
Yeah. And one of the biggest stark differences I thought was funny was in the future, Magneto is the one in the wheelchair in the comics because Professor X is dead. So I think they were lacking a character in a wheelchair.
That's so strange.
And they needed to put
it's
Magneto
also just
in
a
one.
nice symmetry. That he ends up in the. I mean, I just think that's probably where they were going with it.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure.
It's better than that than bald.
Which is not bald, so I guess they kept that. So they have to prevent Mystique, Blob, Destiny, Pyro, and Avalanche. They're the new Brotherhood of Mutants that Mystique has kind of put together.
The Brotherhood of Evil Mutants.
That's true. Yeah. And I think that's a really cool tag of teams going on. So a big difference is Destiny is the one that's supposed to kill Senator Kelly, not Trask, like in the movie. Mm-hmm. So the character's completely different that they're setting out to kill and who's supposed to kill him. But Mystique is still helming that assassination attempt. So long story short, they're trying to get to where they need to go. Wolverine gets pretty much disintegrated into just his adamantium skeleton. Storm dies.
It's that moment, by the way, is like cannot be understated. First of all, the cover with Wolverine in the lights, the sweep of the Sentinel lights is with all the wanted posters and dead and deceased stuff. But this is the most popular character with the X-Men at the time. And this is a moment where like, oh, we're really going to see Wolverine unleash.
And then yikes.
Well, they do a fastball special, which is also the coolest thing ever, which is when somebody big throws Wolverine at the Sentinel. And just in that moment where you're like, oh, he's going to save them. The Sentinel turns around and disintegrates it with a blast.
Which I thought was funny in that panel. So the Sentinel's just like working on his machines and stuff. And they're like, oh, surprise attack. And he's just like, nope. And just disintegrates him. And you have Storm and like Kitty just being like, what the fuck is going on? We're fucked.
So they're not pulling any punches with exactly how bad this future. Also, it's camps like Auschwitz.
Yeah, so that's actually a good point. So they didn't really go into this in the movie, which I thought it's such a it just brings more emotion to it. So in the comic, all the people have jackets, and on their jackets are sewn in just like, the Nazis did to the Jewish people. So it's M for mutant, A for anomalous human, which they carry the mutant gene, but they don't necessarily have powers, and then H for human.
Sure.
So, and there's also a good panel in there where it's like, these people can't breed with these people. It's like, okay, well, I guess you have to say that. Yeah. But yeah, I think there was a scene in the movie where it showed M's seared into the faces of mutants. You only get
where you get Bishop.
Well, I think the difference between the Sentinels killing versus the Sentinels capturing, I mean, like, they didn't have opportunity in the movie because they're all dead.
Yeah, I mean, it shows them in the camps and it shows the neck braces that dampen their powers.
Yeah.
But then they essentially like leading them to the slaughter. It's
but and from a literary standpoint, X-Men begins in the context of things like the Holocaust. That's Magneto's origin, and it's very clear those racial hatreds are exactly what this is an allegory for. And the idea that the future resembles
that
Auschwitz, resembles the Holocaust. Sorry, I didn't mean to. I get worked up and I stutter for some reason. Anyway, resembles the Holocaust isn't an accident. It's I think
yeah. I mean, and so. The weirdest thing about this story, so Kitty stops Destiny from assassinating Senator Kelly by just walking through her and making her miss her shot, and then they're all fine. I also think it's funny in the panel. This is a really short story, so there's really not much to it other than somebody gets sent back into the past to stop an assassination from pretty much destroying them in the future.
Yeah.
So I think there's a really funny part in the comic where the X-Men that have survived and get to the conference that Senator Kelly's going to be assassinated at, Professor X is there, and he sees the X-Men in like their normal clothes, not their like X-Men outfits.
Yeah. And
he's like, "Hey guys, what's going on? Like, why are you here?" And they're like, "Oh, assassination attempt."
Yeah.
And then they change into their costumes. I don't know. Really weird for them to do that. Kind of takes you out of it. So another big difference between that and the movie was I liked how they explained the Sentinels being able to take on all of the X-Men.
Oh, yeah.
By using Mystique's genetic material for them to kind of shapeshift into what they need.
Yeah.
I always thought that was a really cool addition to it. So there are some good things with this interpretation of the movie.
The movie's pretty strong, honestly, I thought.
Yeah, so the story ends. Kitty wakes up as in like a Wizard of Oz ending type thing. She's like, "You were there and you were there." And that's it. Nobody knows if the future was fixed, if it's just inevitable that it's going to happen. They don't know. That was the end of the story.
That's fantastic. First of all, the idea of leaving it that way is great.
Yeah.
Well, because again, like in most alternate universes, it's like the timeline is destroyed. You won.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think they did. I'm not going to get into like the sequels and prequels that they came out with well after the fact. I think there's like Days of Future Present and like Hulk had his own before it happened. And that's also in the comic, they explain that anybody with superpowers is considered a mutant.
Yeah.
So like we had talked about earlier.
Four.
Yeah. We talked about earlier that they kind of show you, oh yeah, this is happening in the Marvel universe in general.
Yeah.
Like everybody, Captain America is considered a mutant.
Yeah.
All of that stuff. And also I will mention they were going to nuke New York. Since it was all contained to New York, they're just going to nuke it. Like all the world powers were just like, that's being fucked up over there. We should just nuke it and get it done with. It's like, yeah, because nuclear fallout and winter and all that stuff wouldn't play into the rest of the United States.
Yeah. Solution.
Yeah. So that is Days of Future Past.
But yeah, it was such a powerful story. It set the precedent that like, time travel generally could be a viable story, so to space or to alternate timelines for X-Men comics.
What year did Days of Future Past come out?
In the comic?
Yeah.
Like when did it take place?
Well, when was the issue printed? What was it again?
1981.
Yeah, so that is a pretty old story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I was like, wait, are you talking about the...
No, yeah. I know, all of the dates and timeline questions.
I mean, a number of characters come from this timeline or involved in it, like Bishop. And also, I just think the idea that like this is... It kind of gives a significance to Xavier's dream, because the stakes for X-Men stories from then on, if not before, but especially from then on, are if we fail, the entire future is doomed. Mm-hmm. And I think, really
I do think there's a funny difference between the movie and the comic also, that in the movie it's like Magneto was right and like being like, these people are going to be the doom of us, but in the comic it's like, this was pointless because we don't know if it changed anything or not, just because of the way it was like set up. I always thought that was really funny. But there is a really cool quote that Kitty said in this when she first wakes up by going in, because you have to remember she experienced all of her teammates dying. I mean, all of these people died. Franklin Richards also dies, which he's the boyfriend of Rachel Summers, and he dies real quick. He just gets disintegrated right off the bat.
That surprises me.
It's like, oh, you were not that powerful then. So
because he was just a really powerful telepath back in those days. He didn't have all the reality altering yada yada.
Yeah, they like as soon as Wolverine, Kitty, and Franklin are like leaving to go get her to Rachel to get her consciousness sent back, he like walks out and then a sentinel just disintegrates.
Well,
and it's
like,
like,
one way to put
that
the
was
stakes
quick.
Well, that's also like with telepaths in comics, it's always like, he can destroy every mind on the planet. We're fighting a robot. I'm going to sit here and let you guys do that.
Yeah, but the one of the quotes she said, she was like, we fought, we lost, we died, and now seeing all of you alive, oh God, I didn't think it would hurt this much. And that to me, like when I remember reading this comic, I was just like, damn, like
Did you cry?
No, I just like, cause seeing her like, especially go back to like her former smaller self. And I don't know, it's just, it's a really good point to the story that like all of the stuff that Xavier was trying to fight for didn't work. Like this is the X-Men's greatest failure as far as trying to unite humans and mutants together. And it just didn't work. And that's what this dystopian kind of alternate timeline showed, if how far it would go.
And I think to add to that, what's important about this too is this is our timeline. Now, it gets confusing because it's an alternate timeline, but the idea is the events here determine whether or not that does happen.
Yes.
And that's an important distinction because some other things that we're going to talk about don't necessarily work that way. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. Sometimes alternate dimensions are hypothetical and interesting, but at the same time, it's like, well, everybody's Spider-Man in this dimension, but that's not us. That's not, in this case, this is something that we have to really kind of give a shit about.
That's true, because a lot of people didn't know if this was going to be canon, or like if it was going to be fixed. Are all these people actually really dead? Because like you said, that first cover of Kitty and Wolverine, and behind them, it just shows like, you know, Archangel slain and Magneto apprehended and Storm dead and all this stuff. It's like, what is going on?
I mean, those are iconic images.
Yes, very much so. So yeah, that's one of my favorite ones. The movie was okay. The comic's much better, but that's how most of the X-Men movies have been. It's like, it was decent.
Yeah. I think, and I'd like to hear your feelings on this, Caleb, but also I'd like to at least get the feeling across well, if that makes any sense. So even if the details are different, the plot's wrong, the idea of like the foreboding nature of the future and we've got to stop it in the earlier timeline.
No, I agree. I out of like the new trilogy that we have, obviously not including Dark Phoenix, but I think Days of Future Past is my least favorite. And I think it sounds like it's because of a lot of the changes that they made. But I feel like, of course, like the emotional impact and what they were trying to say did come across very clear.
Yeah, and it is this weird thing where like they use the opportunity of X-Men The Last Stand because everybody's already dead in it, because that's still part of the continuation of that story. So then they also had less people to send back in time. And it was just kind of, it seemed like they were trying to clean it up. Yeah. But it also was very messy because there was no exposition or explanation of like a lot of the stuff that was happening, why Kitty was doing what she was doing, where they were at, and why it works. So yeah,
they get special points for at least having Iceman be cool in this.
He died right off the bat.
Yeah, but we get to see his powers and him do shit before all the other Iceman moments. Before he's like, I made a rose for you. Look at that. Oh, I froze a lake. Like, oh, that's why you're
sound
cool.
like that to you.
Because that's how it feels.
Yeah, he makes like a little pond turn into ice skating rink, and that was it.
At least in this, we get ice slides, him freezing shit. I'm like, okay, that's a minor thing.
I do agree. There was a lot of really cool shining moments, but it's like a little too late.
Yeah.
Because then you just kill him and whatever. That's my spiel on the movie compared to the comic. Read the comic. It's really good. All right. And we're going to get into our last one. I commend Kayla for picking this one because it's very timey-wimey. But it is another great story. So take it away, Kayla.
Yes, of course. So the alternate timeline that I ended up choosing was Age of Apocalypse. And I will get to how convoluted and complicated that is later. What kind of helped me put this into focus was just doing it or trying to find the straight line through which I did it through the character of Apocalypse. So I'm kind of going to explain his like time cycle, because there's actually time travel involved in his story anyway.
Mm-hmm.
And then how Age of Apocalypse kind of breaks that up and like, you know, why it's different. So wait, but before I start, no, there's just this really interesting concept for when Apocalypse was created. So Bob Layton was doing X Factor comics, in the 80s, late 80s. And he was building up for this big, cool character that was going to be leading the Alliance of Evil. And it was supposed to be Owl from the Daredevil villain. But then the issue before the big reveal, Bob Layton just left. So the new character and all the executives were like, okay, it's not Owl. We have to make a really cool character. And that's how Apocalypse came in.
That's interesting.
They wanted like a Magneto level villain. And I think they succeeded because he's used in and out of the universe a lot.
You're telling me Owl wouldn't have been Magneto?
It is honestly beyond comprehension, the idea that Owl would have. By the way, if you're a Daredevil fan, Owl's a pretty cool character. He's interesting and he's
right, but
enigmatic.
to like take on the entire X-Men, like
well, yeah,
to be this level of a character.
They were probably thinking like, let's do a Lex Luthor planning type.
Yeah.
But yeah, thank Insa Banur that we got.
Thankfully he left.
Yeah.
Insa Banur, by the way, Apocalypse's real name.
Yeah.
I will not be referring to him as that because it'll trip me up all the time. Okay, I know what his name is.
Yeah.
He's gonna be Apocalypse to me. It's just easier to say. But yeah, I mean, his character, he is the first human, maybe not to have the X gene, but to see it fully, like full formed, being able to use it. Born with gray skin, blue lips, left abandoned in the woods by his people.
Wonder why.
Yeah, that always goes well in mythology and stories, right?
In comics, if you are born another color, you are fucked. That is,
or become a supervillain.
Yeah.
But he was basically found by the Sandstormers, raised to believe the survival of the fittest mentality. So that's kind of who Apocalypse is. He kind of goes through the cycle and like tests people. He likes pushing the earth in the cycle of growth, judgment, and destruction.
He's a lot like Ra's al Ghul now that I think about it. I never made that comparison
with
before.
superpowers.
Yeah.
Oh my god, I was going to, because you guys really like the powers list off. I was going to attempt to do that, but basically he can do anything. Just think of something cool that an X-Men can do, and he could probably do that.
Also, he's got all these powers like the Eternals. I think he's got very similar stuff, but he also he discovered a ship made by the Celestials.
Yeah.
We talked before, and he got their powers too, or a lot of them. So that's the explanation for like, why he's
great.
Yeah,
why not?
Well, because the person that found him and raised him showed him the technology that the Celestials left behind. And you kind of see it in the movie. That's how he like goes on and off between like suspended hibernation, and then he comes out and then like walks the world, finds people, and is like, hey, look, I'm a god. And then they're like, oh my gosh, and then kind of worship him as a deity. So yeah, Oscar Isaac got that right.
In the X universe, he's I really think the most terrifying character that they regularly fight.
He's like the Thanos just in their universe.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a really good analogy, I think.
Yeah. But yeah, basically, during one of the periods in modern times, quote unquote, in the comics, when he's in suspended hibernation, Cable comes back, and that wakens him up, and that's when like Apocalypse's actual stories takes place.
Fucking Cable, always messing shit up.
Well, there's a reason things. There's a reason he came back in time to do that. But yeah, Cable came back to try to kill Apocalypse and ends up waking him up, starting it. Irony. And of course, the iconic stuff with Apocalypse happens. He has the 4 horsemen, which are pretty cool. And then his story in the future, it's 39th century. It's way in the future, but he's like
really far.
Yeah, it is. But and like he's kind of assumed, and everyone's kind of assumed he's kind of immortal, or at least he ages very slowly. But at this time, he's kind of like disintegrating, dying. And he's trying to transfer his consciousness over into Nathan, who becomes Cable. But he's killed by Nathan, and then Nathan, to stop this from happening, goes back in time to stop Apocalypse. And that awakens him.
Jesus.
And that's how kind of Apocalypse's time travel-y loop works.
Yeah, so he tried to go into him, but then he killed him, and then future Cable's like, I have to go back to stop that, but then it happened again.
Exactly. Okay. So I was like, time travel-y, timey-wimey stuff is already in Apocalypse's story. So Age of Apocalypse.
Oh, I thought that was. Okay.
That's before we even get to the Age of Apocalypse. He's just already got a weird, convoluted time.
Yeah, well, and Kang the Conqueror is already in his origin story too, and Kang the Conqueror is a time traveler, so like time is already kind of essential to Apocalypse. But Age of Apocalypse, 1995 to 96, it's basically, it follows Legion at first, who's Xavier's son.
I love Legion.
I know, he's pretty cool. Cool show, too. My stepdad, big fan.
Really good show.
I love the actor. Basically, Legion goes back in time to try to kill Magneto. And he goes a little too far because the time that he chose, Xavier and Magneto are still BFFs, which they never really aren't. But at this time, they're really close. And so instead of killing Magneto, Xavier like takes the blow and dies instead. And so because Xavier is killed 10 years before Apocalypse is supposed to come out and kind of wreak havoc, he kind of awakens a little earlier.
Good God.
Yeah, it's kind of messy.
Does he have like this weird alarm clock whenever like a big X-Men character dies or just like comes into the timeline?
Well,
He's like, oh wait, no.
Either way, he was going to awaken soon.
Yeah.
It's just 10 years before.
Yeah.
And Xavier is dead. But basically Xavier's sacrifice kind of pushes Magneto's morality in his favor. So Magneto, Eric, kind of becomes Professor X, or takes over his spot, starts to be the leader of the X-Men. So basically when Apocalypse awakens, these different factions of resistance, pockets of X-Men, like arise and try to stop him. But Apocalypse kind of takes over North America, starts doing cullings, which is basically killing a lot of people, humans. And then to prevent himself from being stopped, he also adds any mutant with like telepathy or psionic powers to the list, so he starts killing those mutants off.
You can't have any competition.
No, exactly. But Bishop goes back in time to stop Professor X from being killed, and
you have too many people trying to prevent shit from happening, and it's just making it worse.
Yeah. And why isn't anyone killing Hitler?
But yeah, basically Bishop goes back in time, stops Professor X from being killed. This story is told through 8 interlocking issues and stories that are going on at the same time. It follows the different factions. Cable is still there because I feel like he's pretty intrinsic to Apocalypse's story, but he's Nate Gray in this universe. It was just kind of, it's really hard to follow. The beginning and overarching story isn't, but it's, like I said, it's an X-Men Alpha, Caliber, Generation Next, Amazing X-Men, Weapon X. There's just a lot.
You ran out of X names.
No, exactly. There were more. I just felt.
I mean, I'm glad when events like this and that's another thing about these like alternate timelines is they happen in so many different comics because they're like, well, it deals with these people, or they make comics for it. It's like, wait, like 2 years and it will all be combined into one, easy to follow.
Well, Age of Apocalypse 2 was so popular that even when these titles like Alpha, Caliber, Generations churned into other things, like Cable finally he gets his thing back too and all of that.
Oh, this one it came out was the bee's knees.
Yeah,
this was
and they continued it even when they corrected the timeline.
Yeah.
Like Age of Apocalypse still had its own mini run going on, like parallel to the actual one, and a lot of the characters that weren't murdered in Age of Apocalypse escape into the 616 timeline.
Yes.
So
there's a few things there to just mention. First, it's really cool because it's the world that Apocalypse runs.
Yeah.
Right. So all of our characters that are still alive over there are these gritty, crazy ass, like war-torn versions of the character.
Yep.
Wolverine's a bad dude, and he's missing a hand because Cyclops shot it off, and Cyclops is missing an eye. Wolverine scratched it out.
Oh, God.
Well, okay.
How could he do that?
Yeah.
Because Wolverine's hands are still, like, all the ligaments and flesh and stuff like that. Like, he, you know what I mean?
Oh, I guess, the adamantium of that.
Yeah, we assume the ligaments tore and everything like that. But anyway, that's the details.
No, yeah, it's a good point to bring up. This kind of has a lot of the 90s grit to it.
You took out my eye, I'm going to take your hand.
Yeah, I mean, that's just a little... Mr. Sinister is kind of like around and has his own group of like hound like sort of characters that he raises. This is where Blink comes from. Yeah. All these X-Men characters that Magneto ends up being like the leader of are like I don't know, like all Rwandan, like what do you call it, like refugees that are all existed as a war torn place. So they're all fucked in the head, and like they've never. There's this in Exiles actually that Blink had never had coffee before. To give you a sense of exactly how fucked up the world that they were living in was.
Are you telling me Apocalypse got rid of coffee?
I was never, or Pop-Tarts. Yeah, Pop-Tarts.
Well, and another character that wasn't in the original Apocalypse story was Psylocke. They just kind of wrote her in with very little explanation. They were just like, Psylocke's here now. Yeah.
She's going to fuck shit up.
But I think one of the things they did that you sort of mentioned, which I think is now happens a lot, if they make a really cool timeline or alternate universe and they realize, oh, these characters are marketable, it's very common. This happened with Miles Morales in the Ultimate Universe. They're like, well, let's just bring them over.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you had X-Man, Nate Gray, that had a Cable's alternate thing without the virus.
Which he's a thing currently happening right now.
Yeah, absolutely. It's Cable, but without the what do you call it? Techno-organic virus.
Yeah.
And his whole deal is he's this ultra-powerful mutant, but because he's got this techno-organic virus, he has to constantly use his telekinesis to put it at bay. So it makes him a little bit, and that's why he's got guns. This is a character who doesn't have that problem.
Yeah.
So he's just like nigh powerful or whatever.
Yep.
But you got Dark Beast and Blink and Sugar Man and all these. A lot of them suck. But anyway. I
think Sugar Man's one of the characters that escapes into 616.
Yeah.
I like how they can just escape. They're like,
that's what I meant. All those characters I listed were ones that like made it over.
Yeah.
Yeah. And they're terrifying.
So that's it. This one also has a movie, technically.
Apocalypse's story.
Yeah, because it closely looks like a translation from the story you just said. And
I really like the movie. And I love Oscar Isaac.
I do too. So I think it was funny when you were like, yeah, they just brought Psylocke in and she was like there. It's like, yeah, they did that in the movie too.
Yeah, exactly. That's a good point. Apocalypse seems kind of, it's a weird fusion. I mean, obviously it didn't extend and Apocalypse didn't win at the end. So that movie didn't change the timeline or anything like that. It's just.
There's he looked like Isaac Ooze, people say.
I thought that the first time I saw him.
Okay, so they messed up. They should have done mocap. They could have had Oscar Isaac. Now, I don't know what the budget was. Maybe that's a big problem. But I was just talking to my mom, actually, over here on the phone about how she's like, who's in that movie? This is my mom. She's like, who's in that movie? Who's playing Thanos? And I was like, oh, Josh Brolin, the guy from the Goonies. Is like, well, he doesn't look. But I was like, no, you can really see him inside of Thanos.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, they modeled his face too, kind of.
Yeah, exactly. So the actors, but he's this physically hulking thing. And
I think they motion captured his face.
That's what I mean.
Yeah,
he's like really in it. And my mom was like, well, I don't like Thanos very much. It's not really but they could have, you really wish that they had taken Oscar Isaac and done a mocap and had his face in this much larger imposing thing.
Yeah.
As opposed to just putting him in makeup.
Because it's one of the really only major criticisms about that movie is that, and I think it really stands and falls on the fact that Apocalypse just
mine was the ending, like how he got beat. Like I like the moment.
That was cool.
I like the moment of Magneto like creating the X with the beans.
Me too,
I'm like,
shivers.
no, I betrayed him, not you. And I was like, oh yay! But then you just have Phoenix just.
Yes, but
ending it. I'm like, ugh,
I'm a sucker for any time of like the Avengers or X-Men or Justice League are fighting like a big bad and they just all like blast him and beat the shit out of him. That's how they win. Like it's meat and potatoes, but I'm like, that's how you do it.
It's very reminiscent of Darkseid. How they did it, just Hail Mary.
Yeah.
But no, I agree. I enjoy the movie because the acting is so good.
The acting is really good in that one. Yeah, I agree. Especially like James McAvoy.
And you almost get a little annoyed when people are like, oh, he doesn't look like Apocalypse. I don't like how he looks. It's like, yeah, I'm starting to think that's not even really Apocalypse. I'm starting to think it's an actor depicting him. And that we as an audience should suspend disbelief. But you could be right that it isn't him.
You're right, though. I mean, I feel like if they would have made him a little more intimidating.
Yeah, it would have been easy because he totally nails it.
Well, because in this timeline, he takes over the world.
Yes.
To me, though, like the point of them making that movie seemed pointless. Only because of what the next one is.
About capitalism, yeah.
Well, no, I didn't understand the point of like why they went that route, and then they're doing the Dark Phoenix saga. It's like you're just doing all of the major X-Men ones back to back to back.
It feels like a weakness that the Marvel Cinematic Universe didn't have, because the Marvel Cinematic Universe was like, let's be inspired by the general canon, but we're going to write our own story.
Yeah.
I mean, the characters didn't deal with the Thanos level character.
Yeah.
They were dealing with, just their everyday villains that happened to be having high stakes. It was, but the X-Men ones, the new one so far, it's been like all of the big bads.
They always go through the world-ending events.
Yeah. And for, like, we need to translate the big stories at the cost of telling our own story. And I think a great X-Men Last Stand was a great example of that. We're like, we want to do the Cure story, and we want to finish the Magneto story. And it just felt like they were trying to, and the Dark Phoenix story. Yeah. They were like, we need to just hit all the major notes. It's like, well, do a solid story.
Yeah.
And then if you can intersect with a major story from the comics, great.
Also, another weird thing that I find with that is, so Jean Grey already has the Phoenix. Maybe. But in the Dark Phoenix that's coming out, you see her get the Phoenix. So
not in this timeline. I don't know.
Yeah, because you see her, because she's in the shuttle in the trailer at least, and like the Phoenix goes into her, and they're like, "Is she dead?" Blah blah blah. But she just killed Apocalypse.
I agree. Well, and I mean, maybe that's just her power, and it's just simpatico. But if they have that problem in the movie, then they are in good company in the comics, because the comics have been equally vague about like where Jean's. There was a time when Jean was very powerful and was sort of inspired by the Phoenix, but it was just all her telekinesis and telepathy. But she still wore the outfit and was all like,
I mean, that outfit is amazing.
Way.
So
it's
like,
amazing.
Keep wearing that one.
I have a cosplay of it. I think it's cool.
But her telekinesis would look like the Phoenix.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, I'm just inspired. We had a connection, or so it was. Yeah, it's just. I
just think my biggest, I guess, pet peeve with that movie is that it's like, okay, of course, the Phoenix is here, and that's what ends it, instead of like following kind of at least some sort of the original storyline with how he was defeated. I don't know. It's just
I don't think you're wrong
is
at all.
The whole point of this, and there's so many alternate ones that I wish did not exist. Yes. But yeah. Comic book recommendation time. All right, so I'm obviously not going to recommend the comic I just told you all the spoilers about. You should read it, but I'm not going to recommend it. I'll recommend another alternate timeline one. So House of M. I have recommended Children's Crusade, and we've talked about the comics that kind of revolve or came from this one. It's started in June 2005. It's by Bendis. So, of course, Scarlet Witch makes a terrible alternate reality. And who remembers how it used to be? Wolverine. Why? Because he can heal?
I like that.
Yeah, so it's essentially X-Men or mutants are rulers of the world, and Magneto is their leader. Fantastic story. Really good. It's not that many issues. I believe it's only like 8 issues. But it's by Bendis, so pick that up.
Of course, yeah. So because I was focusing so much on Apocalypse, I only felt it right to recommend something with Apocalypse, but not Age of Apocalypse, because like I said, that's complicated. But you should read that. So I'm going to do Apocalypse Wars, which it was released in 2016. It's basically Apocalypse returns and puts the mutant teams through trials because, he's a judgy piece of shit. But one of the more interesting aspects is the all-new X-Men, Genesis and Young Beast, get sent back in time, where a clone of Apocalypse teams up with a younger version of himself. I know, because clones and time travel are confusing.
Great.
But no, basically it shows Apocalypse back before he donned the name and was actually a pretty decent dude. So,
I want to be there whenever he decided to name himself Apocalypse. Mm-hmm. My name is John, but now it's Apocalypse.
When I was doing research for the character, I know you wanted me to tell the story, and that's probably you goading me. But basically, long story short, after the Sandstormers, I think, were already dead, he fell in love with Ozymandias' sister. And then when she found out who he really was, she's like, "Ugh, you have gray skin. I don't like you anymore." And Ebsemenor became Apocalypse because I'm Apocalypse now.
Yeah.
Poor heart. Broken.
Yeah, basically. Spurned in love. So, Jared, what do you recommend?
Well, I was going to do Old Man Logan, but I feel like we'll probably do a Wolverine deep dive sometime on the horizon. And also, I felt like because my because I did Exiles, and that's very jet setting and weirdly optimistic. I thought I'd do another one that's like that. So there was a series and it came out in 1998 and ran to 2001 called Mutant X. It was written by Howard Mackey and had a bunch of different pencilers and stuff like that. But it's a little bit more, hey, the alternate timeline that this happens, or alternate parallel universe or whatever that this happens, isn't the whole world is destroyed and worse. It's just a bit different. And Alex Summers, Havoc, who is a character, is Cyclops' brother.
Yeah.
Is a character that I feel like they're always just looking to do something with.
Because he's not Cyclops.
He can be a bit boring on his own. You know, he's very like, just, I'm a upstanding, square-jawed gentleman, and I like to help
just
people.
Kill him randomly in the movie.
So, yeah, exactly. So in this, exactly, because I didn't know what to do with him. So in this case, he gets randomly tossed. There's a story, but it's not. It's just, a reason for this to happen into another dimension that's not too much different than our own, but the X-Men all have slightly different histories because of their adventures in the past. So to give you an example, Storm is a vampire. Iceman has powers like Rogue because he had an exchange with Loki where he had his powers greatly increased, so he can't touch anybody without freezing them. Beast goes too far with his mutation, and he becomes even more beastly. So that kind of stuff. And he finds himself. And it was just a really, really solid, fun series. So definitely worth checking out.
Yeah.
Mutant X.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks for listening. Follow us on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter at The Phantom Zone Pod for more podcast updates.